por.
Thank you, Marcella, for the introduction. I can barely describe how excited I am to be with you over the next 2 days. I only wish it could be in person so we could sip coffee and break bread and talk our way into friendships. We bring the warmest greetings from the board of the International Thomas Merton Society to those of you who are attending and participating in this, the fourth Merton Conference held in Argentina. We owe a debt of gratitude to Cuyo National University and the ITMS Argentine Westlands chapter for hosting this conference, and to Marcella and the organizing group for putting together a diverse and exciting program. The International Thomas Merton Society exists to promote an understanding and appreciation of the multifaceted character of Thomas Merton, to encourage reading, study, and research of the works of Thomas Merton, and to promote communication and cooperation among scholars and persons interested in Merton. Certainly, these are some of the reasons why we're meeting, but not all. Some of us gathered here may be exploring the life and writing of Thomas Merton for the first time, drawn perhaps by his poetry or his exploration of the contemplative life. Some of us gathered here have been exploring his writing and life for decades, having found in him a creative and provocative dialogue partner. Thomas Merton continues to draw people into his orbit nearly 60 years after his untimely death. He was first and always a monk, but a monk who was an essayist, poet, translator, social commentator, spiritual theologian, visual artist, photographer, and teacher. He joined a cloistered, silent monastic order, intending to give up his aspirations as a writer, but produced over 50 books, 7 volumes of poetry, and since his death, there have been 7 volumes of his journals, 5 volumes of personal correspondence, and dozens of hours of recorded lectures released. His writing has been translated into many languages. Merton was a restless seeker of truth and crossed the boundaries of Christian traditions and other faith traditions to find it. He longed for solitude, but was in constant conversation. From his cell and hermitage, he reached out through letters to poets, artists, psychologists, theologians, writers, airplane pilots, and children from around the globe. He submitted to staying at the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky, but his spiritual restlessness meant he never stood still in his intellectual and spiritual development. Merton then was a man of many interests and almost as many contradictions. Merton lived in a time of violence and change, 2 world wars, the advent of atomic weapons and the Cold War, the Vietnam War, space exploration, Vatican II, and the Civil Rights Movement in the USA, and the throwing off of the shackles of colonialism by African nations were just some of the markers during his 53 years. We too are living in violent and difficult times. We're in an era of perpetual war. Nationalist and fascist governments are scapegoating immigrants and refugees. The rainforests in South America and forests across Canada and Europe are burning up. Farmers struggle to plant and grow food in the midst of climate change. Political discourse is highly polarized. We're overwhelmed by noise and distracted by the perpetual sound bites of social media. In the midst of this, Merton's voice calls us to be peacemakers and insists on the underlying dignity and unity of humanity. There is rarely a day in his journals that does not demonstrate his attentiveness to the Kentucky landscape and weather. Birds and deer were his spiritual teachers. He spoke of the need for an ecological consciousness. He preferred dialogue to debate, but did not shirk to call out the political evils of his time. He affirmed our deep need for silence and solitude. Merton's voice then continues to have a contemporary feel about it. His writing and his witness can assist us to address the issues of our time. The beauty of our gathering in Argentina is that it allows us to uniquely engage together. We're gathered here from 4 continents and at least 7 countries. We are interacting with Merton's life and work from multiple perspectives as educators, artists, writers, and poets. We're exploring his contributions to peace, prayer, philosophy, and poetry. We're looking We are looking at his engagement with others through his letter writing and drawing him into conversation with people he never met. And the experience is deeply enriched by its international flavor. We are insisting in an era of isolationism that we desperately need to hear one another's truth. We are testifying to our common humanity and our need for each other. My hope, though, is that we use this time together for more than intellectual advancement. Merton's own life witnesses to the value of friendship. Those who met him spoke of the deep impression his attentiveness, humor, and care made on them. I have never attended a Merton conference and left without making friends. Marcela, Guadalupe, Dominiek, and Cristóbal are only a few I have come to know in the last decade. Talk with someone you don't know at the lunch break if you're in person. Exchange email addresses in the Zoom chat box with speakers and attendees who catch your attention. Cross some boundaries. Come away from these 2 days enriched intellectually and spiritually. Come away with new avenues of inquiry, but come away also with new friends. If we can deepen our learning and expand our friendship over these 2 days, we will have truly honored Merton's legacy. Marcela, thanks again to you and your colleagues for your efforts in putting this together.
Thanks, Paul. I'm really very happy and honored to have you here at our Argentine meeting. And okay, for people who have been listening, if you have checked the chat, this is the way we'll work through these 2 days. So I'll be writing a sort of synthesis in the language in which the speaker doesn't speak. So, muchas gracias, Paul, por esta presentación y por aceptar la invitación a formar parte de las jornadas argentinas en homenaje a Thomas Merton. Y bueno, ahí he ido poniendo en el chat para que vean la manera en la que vamos a trabajar en estos 2 días, una especie de traducción sintetizada a medida que cada persona va hablando. Entonces, Paul nos habló en inglés y fui haciendo una síntesis de lo que nos iba diciendo en español en el chat. Bueno, vamos entonces a comenzar. Ustedes tienen el programa de las jornadas. Enseguida lo voy a compartir también en el chat. Vamos a comenzar con las primeras ponencias de la mañana. Si bien en un primer momento, cuando organizamos estas jornadas, pensamos en un tema que tenía que ver con la poesía de las Américas, dado que este año se cumplirían 100 años del nacimiento de Ernesto Cardenal, que fue novicio y luego muy amigo de Thomas Merton. Después pensamos que las jornadas podían estar abiertas a distintas temáticas, justamente por la pluralidad de intereses, la diversidad de temas que normalmente tiene el público interesado en Thomas Merton, y eso es lo que hemos logrado, creo, con estas jornadas. Están organizadas las ponencias siguiendo un hilo más o menos temático que va a comenzar a continuación. So originally we had thought of this conference under the title Poetry of the Americas, coinciding with Ernesto Cardenal's 100th anniversary. Later yet, we thought that it would be better to have papers on very different topics, because Thomas Merton is such a polyphacetic author and person that, and in addition, people interested in Merton have so many different perspectives that allowing them into the conference would provide a very rich and diverse consideration of Thomas Merton. So in a moment, I'm going to share the schedule and the program in the chat. Anyway, you all have it. So we'll start with the first conference, And in all cases, we'll follow the same pattern. I will introduce the speakers first in Spanish, then in English, and then the speaker will present. Voy a presentar entonces en cada caso a la persona que va a hablar, siempre primero en español, después en inglés, y luego a medida que vayan hablando, como hicimos recién, si hablan en inglés, traduzco una síntesis en el chat. Bueno, la primera presentación está a cargo de Dominiek Lootens, que es consejero internacional de la International Thomas Merton Society. Dominiek es autor de Open to the Full Dimension, Thomas Merton, Practical Theology and Pastoral Practice, publicado en 2022. Dominiek dirige el Centro para el Diálogo en Rydberg Campus en Frankfurt am Main, Alemania, y es cofundador de Mindful Dialogue Network for Attention and Kin-Making. Dr. Dominiek Lootens, International Advisor to the ITMS, is the author of Open to the Full Dimension, Thomas Merton, Practical Theology and Pastoral Practice, published in 2022. He is director of the Center for Dialogue at the Rydberg campus in Frankfurt am Main, Germany, and he is co-founder of Mindful Dialogue Network for Attention and Kin-Making. Well, thank you, Dominiek, for being here, and we are all ears now.
Thank you very much, Marcela, and I'm very happy and grateful that I can join you here today in this wonderful conference. I'm going to focus on a very specific topic, and I hope that it will trigger your attention, your curiousness, and your imagination. The title of my talk is To Silence the Truth is to Bury Gold. Thomas Merton's interaction with the maxims of Evagrius Ponticus in Mignen. In a letter Merton wrote in the fall of 1956 to his friend Jean Leclerc from a Benedictine from Luxembourg, Merton writes, "More and more I feel attracted to Evagrius." In the same year, in November, on November 19, he writes to Victor Hammer, his Austrian friend and artist who lived in Lexington and published with Merton beautiful volumes. And he writes the following to Victor Hammer: "This is something I can be thinking about all along in my reading. I think in particular of a little selection from a very interesting and little-known monk called Evagrius, who was in fact very important. How about a book of sayings of Evagrius?" So I take these two quotes as a starting point for my little talk and research. What did he do with this idea that he talked about with Jean Leclerc and Victor Hammer? So in 1956, Merton wrote to his friends Leclerc and Hammer that he was reading Evagrius. The editors of the beautiful edition of Merton Hammer's correspondence state that this reading led to the booklet What Ought I to Do? Sayings of the Desert Fathers, which was printed by Victor Hammer in 1959. In my view, this is not entirely correct. It is true that some of the Desert Fathers whom Evagrius knew are mentioned by name in this booklet. However, Evagrius is not named at all. In the expanded edition, The Wisdom of the Desert, which was published by New Directions in 1960, Evagrius is mentioned only once by name. But in 1964, Merton decided to work on a manuscript that focused explicitly on texts by Evagrius. He made his manuscript available to the guest house library so that guests who came to Gethsemane could benefit from it. Merton lived at a time when Evagrius was once again being studied more intensively. He read the French translations and studies by Guillemot and Hausherr and used them in his courses for novices. But the books from Guillemot and Hausherr were not published until 1958 and 1960, respectively. So I was wondering, which text by Evagrius did Merton read in 1956? From the books listed in the Merton Center, it appears that he read the Evagrius texts in Migne, Patrologia Graeca 40 thoroughly. He underlined a lot and made some notes in the margins. In my opinion, Merton read Migne in 1956 and took him up again in 1964 when he started to work on his manuscripts with sayings of Evagrius. Let me say a few words about Migne Patrologia Graeca 40 for people who don't know it. In the Patrologia Graeca 40, one can find several ascetic works by Evagrius. First, The Monk, a treatise on the practical life. Second, The Foundations of the Monastic Life, a presentation of the practice of stillness. Thirdly, 33 ordered chapters. Fourth, Maximes 2 and 3. Fifth, to monks in monasteries, in communities. And sixth, exhortation to a virgin. Migne, in his time, did not do research on manuscripts for his selection, but drew on earlier editions. To Monks and Exhortation were previously published in Latin by the German librarian Holste in 1663, who used one or more Latin manuscripts. The Foundations and the Monk were previously published in Greek and Latin by the French scholar Cotelier in 1686 on the basis of the Greek manuscripts he found in Paris. The 33 chapters and Maximes 2 and 3 were first published by the French librarian Suarez in 1673, who considered them to have been written by Nilus of Ancyra on the basis of the Vatican manuscripts he used. He published the Greek texts and also his Latin translation. In his edition of Nilus, Suarez explained that his colleague Holste had access to another Greek manuscript in which the chapters and maximes are said to have been written by Evagrius. On the basis of this remark, Galland in 1765 took over the Greek and Latin text from Suarez almost a century later and named Evagrius as their author. Galland also introduced the text of Holste and Cotelier in his edition. He added an extra fragment of the Monk edited by the French scholar Bigot in 1680. Migne in 1848 then included in his edition all the Evagrius texts he found in Galland. He also reproduced Galland's introduction in which Holte's argument about the authenticity of the 33 chapters and Maximes 2 and 3 was inserted. Why do I tell you all of this? I think I'm going to focus now in my talk on Maximes 2 and 3. And you can see how Migne in his edition of 1848 used editions from other people, who then based themselves on manuscripts, who were written between the, let's say, the 9th and the 14th century, mostly in Greek, but sometimes also in Latin. So you can see that Evagrius, who was writing in the 4th century, that he built from then on, there was a tradition of manuscripts in Greek and Latin, which then were published in the 17th century, then taken up again by Migne in the 19th century, and then used by Merton in 1964. So we are part of a very big tradition of manuscript translations, texts that were researched and published. And until today, new editions, now mostly in English, are done based on text of Evagrius. And I wanted to bring that up because we are in the environment of researchers here today who are interested in translations and how manuscripts are used. You can also see, based on this whole history, that it makes a strong, that Merton in that way is very strongly connected to a Europe tradition of manuscripts and translations. So what did Merton do with Migne? Merton produced an English translation of the Foundations to monks and exhortation for his manuscript. He also selected and translated a number of sentences from Maxims 2 and 3 and from the monk. This selection is particularly interesting because it shows which themes in the Maxims and the monk were important to him. In the following, I will focus on his selection and translation of sentences from the Maxims. I'm not going to focus on the monk. Another word, another title for the monk is the Practicus. The dear friend of Merton, who is people who are maybe interested, has at the beginning of this of the 70s, the friend Bamberger, John Eudes Bamberger, has published a beautiful translation of the Practicus. So I'm not going to focus on that today. But what Bamberger doesn't mention, although Merton is mentioned by Jean Leclerc, also in the introduction of that book, is that Merton said, Bamberger, you should make a translation of the Practicus. What is not mentioned is that Merton himself did that partly in 64. But as I said, I'm going to focus now on the sentences from the Maxims. So I looked at the what Merton did in Migne with the Maxims. And typical for Merton is that he underlines. He doesn't have a huge respect for all text. He just uses them and thinks, what can I do with them? And then he underlines. So when I looked at his underlining and notes of the Maxims in Migne, I noticed the following. There are 16 sentences that he underlined, but did not integrate in his 1964 manuscript selection. There are 6 sentences that he integrated in the manuscript, but did not underline in Migne. And there are 5 sentences that he underlined and integrated into his manuscript. How can this be explained? Merton made his selection and translation in 1964, but most of the sentences that he underlined, he didn't use. So I believe that he already read Migne in 1956. Therefore, I think it is likely that he made the underlining at that time. And below, I will give an overview of the sentences on which Merton continued to work. So I'm going to read them out to you, and you will get an idea what is meant by Evagrius sentences. But first, a little bit on Evagrius. Evagrius lived from 345 until 399. Prior to his life as a hermit in the Egyptian desert, he was very familiar with city life, theological debates, and church politics. The intellectual elites he met in Pontus, Cappadocia, and Constantinople were Neoplatonists, Gnostics, Stoics, and Pythagoreans. The ecclesiastical elites with whom he was friends were also familiar with the philosophical thinking of their time and with Christian thinkers such as Clement of Alexandria and Origen. It was the time of the Second Ecumenical Council in which Evagrius was involved. But then, through a whole story, there is a life story on Evagrius. He goes to the desert, the Egyptian desert, and there he gets to know the spirituality of the Coptic hermits, their community life, and their way of teaching, which was based on their interpretation of the Holy Scriptures and God's creation. So I give this as a kind of background because you find this background also in the Maximes of Evagrius. Elter, already in the 19th century, and Chadwick and Eisele later have argued that a considerable number of propositions in the Maximes are based on the sayings of Sextus, a 2nd century Christian writer who himself was inspired by the Neoplatonic sayings of Clitarchus and Porphyry, as well as sayings of Pythagoras. So what I'm trying to say is, similar to Merton, is that Evagrius wrote sentences, maximes, that were very much inspired by the philosophy of his time. And Merton himself was also interested in dialogue with philosophers. So Evagrius was not scared of that because he had a background as a city dweller who was very familiar with several philosophical traditions of his time. Evagrius used the sayings of Sextus and the other sources independently and creatively. So what he does, he gives a Christian touch to philosophical sayings that are also can be found in Neoplatonistic thinkers and in Pythagoras. So he focuses on charity, gentleness, the stranger, the poor, the community, the liturgy, and Christ. So he puts the Maximes clearly within a Christian horizon. According to Corrigan, an Evagrius scholar, you can find a mixture of an urban and a desert spirituality in Evagrius' work. Belcastro, some of you may know him as a Merton scholar, has argued that the mature spirituality of Merton can also be seen in a similar way, as a mixture of a desert and a city spirituality. And this gives us a clue as to why Merton was interested in Evagrius for years. It is noteworthy that Evagrius appears time and again in a number of Merton's works. I have counted 9 books in which Evagrius is mentioned, going from The Ascent to Truth from 1951 to The Monastic Journey, which was published in 1977. So I'm now going to read the sayings or the sentences of Evagrius that, in my view, Merton underlined in 1956, but didn't include in his manuscript in 1964. So the underlined sentences of Evagrius. And you will see that it's like sayings of wisdom that invite you to reflect and to make associations with your own life and with several authors and also with the Bible. So I start. It is absurd for one who pursues honors to escape the labors through which honors are attained. You want to know God? First know thyself. It is strange to think big while doing little. A disposition attached to esteem is a sickness of the soul. It is good to show benefits to all, but more so to those unable to return the favor. If you love what you should not, you will not love what you should. A pure soul is God after God. The arrogant thought is a winnover of virtue. The road is made smooth by mercy. A sullied conscience is an unjust judge. When you want to know yourself as to who you are, do not compare to who you were, but what you have become from the beginning. A pond without water is a soul that lost esteem. If you fear God, know it by your tears. Humility of soul is an indestructible weapon. Jesus Christ is the tree of life. Resort to him, and you will never die. True strength is to eat the body of Christ. So Merton reads Evagrius in 56, and Merton, and these are the sentences that he underlined. This is my thesis. And why is that? I'm going to give a little bit of biographical background. In 1956, Merton was struggling with some personal issues. In the previous year, he had been forced to give up his dream to live as a hermit in an Italian monastery. Grayston, citing the ascetic teachings of Evagrius, has argued that Merton suffered from acedia, the wandering mind. In 1956, he had some controversial meetings and correspondence with the psychiatrist Silburg, who emphasized that his desire to become a hermit was not sincere. Merton quotes him in his diary, and you can see the tone of how Silburg speaks and how some of the topics that Silburg talks about you can connect with the sentences I just read. You are afraid to be an ordinary monk in the community. You like to be famous. You want to be a big shot. You keep pushing your way out to publicity. Megalomania and narcissism are your big trends. Your hermit trend is pathological. If you look at the sentences that Merton underlined but did not include in the 1964 manuscript, you get the impression that the underlining was done by someone suffering mentally. The highlighted sentences seemed like topics that a member of a monastic community in the 1950s might discuss with a therapist. Viewed from a perspective of spiritual direction, the underlining of these sentences in the fall of 1956 helped Merton to reflect on the issues raised in his exchange with Silburg. Perhaps it provided him with some support to continue working on these issues while meditatively reading Evagrius' texts. Now I go back to Evagrius, to the text that Merton translated in 1964, but not underlined, probably in 1956. And you see that the choice of the sentences is totally different. The tone is totally different in his selection. Genuine among friends is the one who shares your circumstances. The cherubim, chastity and gentleness of the soul. The beginning of charity is the presumption of esteem. It is good to grow rich in gentleness and charity. If you wish to be free of sadness, be zealous in pleasing God. And here the title of my talk, To Silence the Truth is to Bury Gold. So I call this Merton reads Evagrius in 1964, and he makes a selection of sentences that he didn't underline in 56. So again, some biographical background. In June 1964, Merton was at a very different place. He had opened up to the world and matured. During that month, he visited Daisetsu Suzuki in New York, which he enjoyed very much. He had developed his contemplative thinking and writing on social justice, peace, interfaith dialogue, literature, art, technology, and ecology. He had expanded his international network of friends and was much happier with his life, hoping of becoming a full-time hermit. So if you look at the sentences that he exclusively chose in June 1964, you can see this positive autobiographical horizon shining through. He chose sentences that focused on friendship, charity, meekness, and natural contemplation. And now, as a third element, I'm going to read the sentences that he underlined in 56 and also translated in 64. A chaste heart is a haven for contemplation. Show benefits to the truly poor, and you will eat Christ. The demon is the guide to the irrational life. A stranger and a poor man is God's eyes medication. One who welcomes them will quickly recover his sight. So again, some topics that he thought were important for him in 56 and also in 64. There is a continuity in Merton's study of the sentences. He underlined this last group and integrated them into the 1964 manuscript. One can understand that the way Merton looked at these themes evolved. Hospitality towards the guest and the poor play a central role in the monastic tradition. No wonder Merton already focused on it in 56. In 64, however, he looked at this issue much more broadly, namely from a social justice and global perspective. As a monk, Merton had a genuine interest in liturgy. In 1964, Merton had already written his important manuscript, Christian Worship and Social Reform. He had a fuller understanding of how liturgy and social justice are intimately connected than he had in 1956. I finish with my conclusion. In 1956, Thomas Merton was struggling with some mental issues. I am of the opinion that these personal circumstances formed the background of his underlining of the sentences from the Maximes of Evagrius in Migne. It is possible that his underlining helped him to look at his life from a spiritual perspective. With Evagrius, he had an opportunity to embed his personal issues in an important and rich tradition of city and desert spirituality. The selection and translation of the Maximes in 64 helped Merton to formulate his focus and intention to become a full-time hermit. Thanks to his selection and translation of Evagrius' ascetic works, Merton had a solid foundation for his beautiful 1965 lecture, A Life Free from Care, in which he explains to his novices what kind of hermit he wanted to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dominiek. Now this is a moment for questions, comments. So if people in the audience would like to start this dialogue, we have a few minutes for this. I don't know if there are questions, comments, or if you want to write them in the chat, I can read them to Dominiek.
Yes, Paul.
Yes, Dominiek, I was wondering, I was fascinated by that. I was wondering, you talk about what showed up in his diaries and what showed up in his underlining, and you did reference a lecture he gave towards the end of his time with the novices. Does Evagrius show up, and are these changes evident in his teaching to the novices over the years, or do you know that?
Yes. He in his teachings of the 60s, Evagrius pops up time and again. For example, in Cassian and the Fathers, because Cassian himself was very much inspired by Evagrius. Researchers say that they knew each other and that Cassian learned from Evagrius, and that Cassian then brought the insights from Evagrius to the Latin West. and introduced it to the Latin West. And that then was the inspiration for the rule of Saint Benedict. So there is this kind of line. And Evagrius is also part of the Desert Fathers. So Merton did his edition on the wisdom of the desert was based on a text from a Belgian Jesuit, Roosweide, who used two Latin manuscripts with sayings of the fathers, which were found in Brussels. And in these manuscripts, Evagrius is mentioned 6 times as one of the Desert Fathers by name. Merton included one of the sayings of Evagrius in Wisdom of the Desert by name, and then also without a name, where he refers to a saying, a quote from Evagrius, where Evagrius refers to Saint Anthony, and Saint Anthony says, "I don't need a Bible, I have the creation, and the creation is the book of life, and this is where I find God." And this is something that Merton also included. So Cassian and the Fathers is one of them. Introduction into Christian Mysticism is another course book. And then the third one, Pre-Benedictine Monasticism. So in these 3 books, which were courses that Merton gave to his novices at the beginning of the 60s, Evagrius is integrated. But what you notice is that Merton focuses, especially in Introduction to Christian Mysticism, less on the ascetic works, the works that I quoted now today. He focuses more on his book on prayer, which is more like a reflection on mysticism, and also on the Gnostic texts from Evagrius, which are very complicated and also not always orthodox. And he discusses that with the novices. What is original here, in my view, in this manuscript that I focused on today, is that it is totally focused on the ascetic works of Evagrius, which are very close to the Desert Fathers. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't know how to raise a hand. I would have liked to do that, but I can't find it here. Can you hear me?
Yes, Liana, yes. If
Okay.
you want to ask questions, don't worry, just turn on your microphones and speak, no problem.
Okay. I had 2 questions, and maybe there isn't enough time to answer to both, but I just wanted to ask these questions to Dominiek. The first one was you mentioned, Dominiek, that Merton had some mental issues around the middle of the 50s. Were they mental issues or were they emotional issues?
Yeah, according to
Maybe.
I think that according he at the time thought that it were mental issues, I think.
Okay.
Because he was very much
Okay.
influenced by this conversation with his psychiatrist Zilburg. And he said more or less that Merton, you are a neurotic and narcissist, and he took that seriously.
Yeah, poor guy.
But it was very unprofessional the way it was done, because it was just based on a few conversations, and the abbot was also involved in it. So it was not a pure therapeutic kind of context in which you slowly step into a therapy in an environment of trust. This was not the case. It was then discussed. And Merton was scared that also in his wish to become a hermit, that this material that is this so-called material that his psychiatrist presented to the abbot, that it would be used as an argument against the fact that Merton would like to become a hermit. So in the 50s, well, you could also argue that he still had to mature a little bit. And accept the fact that he doesn't have to be perfect also in his spiritual life. Just accept himself as he is, And we then know that in 58, he opened himself up to the world and with more contact with other people, but also before that, of course, he was growing to become a mature man, both as a human being and as a spiritual being. So I'm not a therapist. At one point, Merton, in one of his lectures to the novices, said, "We are all a little bit neurotic in our way," and this is also the psychoanalytic kind of idea that we all somehow are neurotic in some way. The question is how to live with that, with our shadow, with our limits, and so on. So at that time, this is my point, in 56, he took that very seriously and thought that he was mentally really troubled. And then in 64, he has a totally different tone and uses the same texts from Evagrius in a very positive way, as a kind of support, as a kind of empowerment, because it's focused then on friendships and relations and so on. So we have the difficulty is that in the time that Merton was reading Evagrius in 56, that there is no diary. So it stops in September in 56, his diary, and then it starts again in 57. So I would almost have to, which I have not done yet, I would almost have to go to the Merton Center to do more research in maybe his notebooks, when one can see that in July already he is reading Origen, and he mentions Origen in his diary, and Origen was very influential for Evagrius. So you can see that he starts to be interested in these old authors, but there is a gap in the diary. So that's why I had to make a thesis or a kind of hypothesis, the way he used Evagrius in the fall and the winter of 56. But I noticed so much that the sentences that he underlined and the sentences that he selected in 64 were so different that I came to this idea, he must have done this work in a different time.
Something there, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And well, that was quite a detective work, I would say. And the other question was more like a rhetorical question, which I just wanted to ask the question, but not necessarily to get an answer. Was this interest in Evagrie and other Oriental fathers part of Merton's moving towards the East, because then he went on to Asia and
Yeah.
Can you see it like that?
Yeah,
Can you look
you
at
can
it like
see
that?
it like that. And he makes, for example, in one of the articles, a new consciousness. I think it's in Zen and the Birds of Appetite, if I'm not wrong, or in Mystics and Zen Masters. He speaks about the new consciousness. And he makes a comparison at the end of this article between Zen and this Eastern tradition of Evagrius. And you must understand that Merton said Evagrius is a kind of part of an intellectual circle in the Coptic desert, who is influenced by Platonism, Stoicism, and so on. And not all the Coptic monks were so intellectual. And some of his friends that he also met in Jerusalem on his way to Egypt came from Rome, from Italy. So there was a movement from people from Italy to go to Jerusalem. Rufinus and Melania started communities there. Evagrius met them there, and they also are very much influenced by philosophy and Gnosticism and so on. And that's a kind of intellectual circle within the Coptic hermits. And then you have the Coptic hermits themselves, who were also critical about Evagrius in his intellectualizing. There's a kind of tension there. And this intellectual circle is very much influenced, so to speak, by a kind of city approach to spirituality, being in dialogue with scientists and philosophers and what is en vogue at the moment, no, in intellectual life. And the Coptic hermits were much more focused on reading what is to find in creation and in the Holy Scriptures without intellectualizing it. But Evagrius has tried to reconcile these two traditions. And then Zen. So Merton says at the end of the New Consciousness that you can make a connection between this Evagrius, he is this Platonistic kind of approach of Evagrius and Zen. But there is a kind of dualism also in this Platonistic tradition, and Zen has helped Merton to get also out of dualism and intellectualism. So Zen also helped to read Evagrius maybe more with the feet on the ground. And more closely to this tradition of the Coptic hermits. And what is interesting is that that Merton translated Evagrius, and my idea is just a week before he went to New York to visit Suzuki, who was the Zen specialist. And Suzuki was already asked before to write an introduction to the wisdom of the desert. So he already saw a connection between this Coptic monks and the Zen tradition. And he asked already Suzuki at the end of the 50s, can you write an introduction? Then it was not allowed to do that. And then in 64, I think before he went to Suzuki, he picked up Evagrius again, focused on his ascetic texts as a kind of good preparation to get into conversation with Suzuki. But this is another, it's a hypothesis, but because he also in 64, he doesn't mention Evagrius in his diary that he's working on that. You can only see in this manuscript that in June 64 that he was finishing this manuscript. Yeah, I hope this is kind of answer. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
This is Hugh Turley, and I'd like to say something about Zilberg because and by the way, this is a very interesting talk. I was not familiar with Evagrius before. This is I have to want to read him now. So it was very interesting. But Zilberg is an interesting character because there were two biographies I read about Abbot Fox, and he was known as quite a schemer there at the Abbey. And I think he arranged this meeting between Merton and Zilberg, and Fox told Zilberg that the more normal Merton appears, the sicker he is. So he was fueling this information to Zilberg, and I think that this talk about whether he was emotionally or mentally unstable is doubtful to me anyway, because of it seems like something that Fox concocted and set Merton up. He was with Merton when he went to St. John's University in Minnesota to meet Zilberg, and then later, when Merton wanted to meet Zilberg for analysis, Zilberg refused to treat him. He said, "No, I won't do that."
Yeah.
I just wanted to say something on that because I'm a little bit familiar with Zilberg and Fox, who would correspond.
Thank you very much. I think what is interesting for me is that on the one hand, and this is a question, I'm a spiritual director myself. How does psychotherapy relates to spiritual direction? And you can say that Evagrius was a spiritual director for other monks. This is known. And of course, he had a lot of psychological insight and some would say therapeutic insight, but he used it within a spiritual context. And so Evagrius, it would also be interesting to look at it at Evagrius from a psychotherapeutic perspective and from a spiritual direction perspective. And these are not totally the same, although they are in dialogue with each other. And I think that the Zilberg approach and the Evagrius approach, that in the end, the Evagrius approach helped Merton more to develop himself and to become mature, because the psychological insight of Evagrius was within a biblical and spiritual context. And this helped Merton to move forward, I think, and to mature. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominiek. Okay, I'll just share while we start with the next presentation by Cristóbal. I share the screen for a moment. You'll be seeing this screen several times today and tomorrow. Okay, this is a flyer from a conference that is being prepared for next year, where interfaith, ecology, and education meet in 2026. And the reason why I'm showing it now is because this conference is being organized by the network co-created by Cristóbal and by Dominiek. Dominiek will be the host in this conference, so I think it's the right moment to present it. I don't know, Dominiek, if you want to add anything on this, and then we go on to Cristóbal.
Yeah, Marcela, Cristóbal, and myself, we have founded a network that is inspired by Merton. It's not a Merton chapter, but we think that the way that Merton approached other people and had a worldwide network, that we want to keep up with this tradition. And I invite you to have a look at his website, www.mindfuldialogue.org. And you can see all the information there. There is a possibility to join us in Germany, but you can also join us online. And until the end of September, you still have the possibility to also send in a paper. And then from the beginning of October, you can register. And it would be great that one of the people that we now meet online, that we could meet each other next year in Europe. So thank you very much. And thank you, Marcela, for bringing this up.
Okay, so now we'll go on to the next presentation. Vamos al próximo expositor de estas jornadas, es Cristóbal Serrán Pagan. Cristóbal Serrán Pagan y Fuentes es profesor en la Facultad de Filosofía de la Universidad Palacky en Olomouc, en la República Checa. Por 24 años fue docente en universidades de Estados Unidos. Es autor de St. John of the Cross, His Prophetic Mysticism in the Historical Context of 16th Century Spain, y de Merton and the Tao. Ha participado en numerosas ocasiones en jornadas internacionales sobre Thomas Merton, ha publicado en el Merton Annual y Merton Seasonal, ha recibido las becas Daggy y Shannon de la International Thomas Merton Society, y actualmente es editor de un volumen especial sobre misticismo y naturaleza para la revista Religions, donde también ha editado antes un volumen sobre misticismo español y otro sobre misticismo y justicia social. Dr. Cristóbal Serrán Pagan y Fuentes is assistant professor in the Faculty of Philosophy at Palacky University in Olomouc in the Czech Republic. He taught at US universities for the past 24 years. He is author of St. John of the Cross, His Prophetic Mysticism in the Historical Context of 16th Century Spain, and another book, Merton and the Tao. He has presented numerous papers at different Merton conferences and has publications both in the Merton Seasonal and the Merton Annual. He is a former Daggy scholar and a fellow William Shannon scholar. He is currently serving as editor of a new special issue entitled Mysticism and Nature for Religions. And he has published previously 2 volumes in this journal, Religions, on Spanish mysticism and social justice. So welcome, Cristóbal. I'm very happy that you can join us in this conference.
Muchas gracias, Marcela, y saludos a todos en Argentina y en Europa y en Estados Unidos y en África. So thank you, Marcela, for the introducing my work. Today, I'm going to share with you a PowerPoint that I presented. I don't have a paper, but I have a PowerPoint. Let me see if I can do it right now. I'm just trying to go here and Yeah, I think it's this one. Just please let me know if you can see it.
Sí, perfecto.
Y a ver, slideshow from beginning. Okay.
Sí, se ve muy bien, Cristóbal. Bien.
Estupendo, muchas gracias. So yeah, since our conference in Argentina has to do also with Hispanic poets, and we are actually celebrating the anniversary of Ernesto Cardenal, I thought that would be a wonderful connection, especially dealing with what I already put in my title, which is the prophetic voices against the madness of wars, greed, and power. Merton and Cardenal addressed the state of the world in the 1960s. So Merton was born in 1915 and died in 1968. And Ernesto Cardenal was born in 1925 and died in 2020. So they were just a few years different apart, but we will talk about how they met and so on. Just here you have in the next slide a little bit of my introduction, which is what Marcela did. And if anyone wants to contact me, you can do it also through email. This is my office email address at Pulaski University in Olomouc, where I'm teaching now. I'm really glad to be back in Europe after 33 years living in the US. I was first a student and then a professor. And here is my abstract that I included. I'm going just to shorten it just for the sake of brevity, but in this presentation, I want to especially focus on the madness of war, greed, and power. I use the translation of the letters edited by Jesse Sandoval. This correspondence and exchange of letters between Merton and Cardenal took place between 1958 to 1968. So they spent almost 9 years of correspondence. And they talk about pretty much everything from political implications to their contemplative writings, questions of war and peace, violence, solidarity, especially with the Latin American poets. Merton actually always said in all the letters that he loved Latin American poets more than North American poets. And he felt that affinity with Latin America, not only with poets, but I have been reading now from Merton's letters in the Hidden Ground of Love, and he said the same thing about Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Nicaragua, you name it. It's quite obvious that he fell in love with the beauty and the spontaneity and the rich culture and history and spirituality found in the Americas, plural, not like Trump wants to see it in North America today. So although some critics of Merton and Cardenal think that their monastic denunciations were out of sync with the rulings of the church, time has demonstrated that the prophetic witnesses, plural, were on the right side of history by showing solidarity and compassion with those who suffered the most, especially their brothers and sisters. As Pope Francis and our current Pope Leo XIV have shown in their speeches, the church must stay closer to those who are least among us, following the preferential option for the poor in the 1968, right? In the meeting with Gustavo Gutierrez and the other bishops and leaders of the church in Latin America. So the main issue is how to be closer to the poor, the victims of war, the disenfranchised, or what we call in biblical terms, the Anawin. Like Pope Francis has said in his address to the US Congress in 2015 when he came to the US, Merton was above all a man of prayer, a thinker who challenged the certitudes of his time and opened new horizons for souls and the church. And he was especially a man of dialogue, a promoter of peace between peoples and religions. So in terms of books in English, where Merton addressed the question of war and peace and the madness of all of it, of course, he started in the 1940s with The Seven-Storey Mountain. And then in the 1960s, of course, you find plenty of wonderful titles and books dealing with this topic, from Seeds of Destruction to Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. And later on, of course, there have been new publications, of course, Faith of Violence, and there have been different anthologies that were published posthumously, and the Nonviolent Alternative, Peace in a Post-Christian Era. And of course, the main reason is that he was silenced by his own ecclesiastical authorities and by people in the church in those days, because they didn't want a contemplative monk who is living in enclosure to address the questions of war and peace and other social justice issues. There have been, of course, many books written lately on these topics. One of them, of course, is by the former Jesuit John Deere, the title is Thomas Merton, a Peacemaker. And then in terms of his poetry, of course, there are also many great works addressing these topics, from The Behavior of Titans, Emblems of a Season of Fury, Cables to the Ace, The Geography of Logrer, and the collected poems of Thomas Merton. In terms of Ernesto Cardenal, of course, he was also a liberation mystic and a poet, a Nicaraguan Catholic priest who became actually part of the Sandinista regime and was actually nominated to the Minister of Culture, even though, of course, he got also in trouble with Sandinistas later on, and actually they almost crucified him and took him apart once Cardenales took a more critical approach of the regime. And he has been very honest and open to call even the current still leader of Nicaragua a dictator. So I leave it as that, because clearly Cardenal was not the typical communist that many people thought, or radical that many people thought he was. But his books in English are also very important in regards to these topics, and especially what brought them together was the monastic life when they met at Gethsemane, and both of them were, of course, contemplative poets. So the Psalms of a Struggle and Liberation, Cosmic Canticle, is a wonderful book that I recommend everyone to read. Love, A Glimpse of Eternity, and the Gospel in Solentiname, which was the community that he founded, and he invited Merton to be part of it. And we will talk about that in a minute. So this is one of my favorite pictures, actually, of Ernesto Cardenal. As you can tell, he had a beautiful presence, full of wisdom and prophetic standing. And in terms of poetry, of course, there are wonderful also works in writings, especially if you want to know more about what he has to say about his experience at Gethsemane. This is your book, Gethsemane in Kentucky. Also, he addressed the question of the American Indian, paying homage to them, with Walker in Nicaragua and other early poems. Then, if you like St. John of the Cross, he wrote this wonderful book of poems titled Telescope, The Dark Night, Flights of Victory, and Pluriverse. So Merton's influence on Cardenal actually is very important from early on. And the exchange of letters, as I mentioned, are both published in Spanish and in English, into English. There is a clear connection between the two of them because, of course, they were at Gethsemane, and Ernesto Cardenal have read Thomas Merton, and he was also attracted to the works of St. John of the Cross. In the 1950s, of course, Merton wrote the book on St. John of the Cross was The Ascent to Truth, which, by the way, is one of the worst books according to Merton's own evaluation. And actually, I just read on one of the letters in the Hidden Ground of Law, he said, this is probably my third worst book I ever wrote, which is interesting because there are very good material there, but it was not his thing to write in a scholastic way. He always wanted to be more experimental and more creative, and he was told to probably write that kind of book and using the scholastic Thomistic theology and of the time, and he found later on that that book was not actually one of his best, it was actually one of his worst. But like Merton, Cardinal actually attended Columbia University a few years after Merton left. So both of them graduated from Columbia University. Actually, you have here a very interesting picture of Cardinal on a boat with the name of San Juan de la Cruz written on it, San John of the Cross. And they actually spent 2 years living together at the Abbey of Gethsemane. Of course, Cardinal went there knowing that he wanted to go deeper into his own spiritual life, and he knew that Merton, as a spiritual director and master, will help him in his own growth. So Merton loved his exchange with Latin American poets and translated poems by a number of good noted poets, including Cardenal in Nicaragua, and Alfonso Cortés, César Vallejo, and Rubén Darío. And Merton's poetry began to change after his contact with Cardinal and other Latin American poets, especially while the earlier poetry was generally written in the shorter lyric form. Later work was more experimental and longer. It's interesting in these quotes that I found where Cardinal said that I began to write poetry when I was 4 years old. And in other words, I was always been writing poetry, while Merton also said that music, art, and poetry attune the soul to God because they induce a kind of contact with the creator and ruler of the universe. So both of them saw poetry as a means, as a tool to express that which is ineffable and to lead their prayers and focus on that which is unknown and can only be experienced, but cannot be defined. But the other thing that Merton actually got from this friendship with Cardinal and years of correspondence is that, of course, Cardinal is also one of the pioneers of liberation theology in Latin America, coming from the historical context of Nicaragua. Here you have a picture of the famous Solentiname community, which was an island in Nicaragua, and Cardinal insisted to bring him to Nicaragua, but of course we know that Merton had a lot of troubles in those days. They didn't allow him to travel. They banned him from traveling and from writing on war and peace. And he tried to go even to Chile and Brazil and many other places, but he was always denied. So he always, he knew that it was not, with Fox, with Abbot Fox, he knew that he cannot move forward. There are many letters where he talks about it, and I don't want to get into that because that will be a different topic. But clearly, liberation theology is very important in both Cardinal and Merton, and they built a network of friends, of poets, of intellectuals, of writers, of activists, of mystics and prophets, and you name it, bishops and others who were interested in bringing the contemplative life into the realm of social justice and vice versa. So the connection in Solentiname is crucial because Solentiname was, by the way, this is a quote from Marcela Raggio in our wonderful volume that we publish in Religions, titled Mysticism and Social Justice. Solentiname was a Latin American project and praxis, but it will not have existed had not been by Merton's presence in Cardinal's life. After Merton's death, Cardinal met some of the Trappist American friends And at the Merton Center, we talk about how he was to go to Salentiname after the Asian journey. And Dan Berrigan asked me, are you sure he's not there? So, of course, Merton loved the idea of being in Latin America, being in Nicaragua or in Brazil or in Chile or in many other places where they were planning to have maybe a new foundation. But in reality, of course, he knew that the folks didn't approve it, and he didn't want to leave the Abbey of Gethsemane for many different reasons. One, he wanted Merton to stay a monk at Gethsemane. He didn't want to open the door for him to leave, because that will, of course, be not good also for the monastery in many ways. I mean, just think about copyrights, money, right? Business as usual, and the selling of all those books. I mean, money matters even in the monastery. As we know, Fox was actually a business person, and Merton criticized him many times for the business of production of cheese and cookies and all this other business, and the noise of industrial machinery brought to the farms. But also Marcela Raggio said, and I quote, I always remember what Merton told me when we talk about the contemplative, that should not be indifferent to the social and political problems of his people, especially in Latin America, where there was much social injustice and frequently dictatorships as well. By the way, of course, when Cardinal is spending 2 years at the Abbey of Gethsemane, he is going through this whole spiritual journey of finding his place and his role and his voice in the world. And what Merton told him, it was very simple. Just be a contemplative, because you don't need to be in a monastery. Just go anywhere and move back if you want to Nicaragua and do your part, because they need you there more than we need you here. So in terms of their correspondence, in a later dated September 11, 1961, Merton wrote to Cardinal, for my own part, I get so impatient with the stupidity and the inexorable descent into confusion that takes place everywhere, especially in the US, that I think is a moral obligation to say something intelligent if I possibly can. The shocking thing is that the whole world is being pulled this way, and that by two enormous powers that are both practically insane, with the same paranoid obsession with power and the same fascination with the technological expansion and the same vulgar and the same brutal stupidity and insensitivity to human and spiritual values. And then Cardinal replied by saying that many intellectuals here are worshippers of God, which represent, of course, the love of power, and they think that the rejection of Magog, which is the love of money, must be the acceptance of God. Most of them think according to the party lines, and that is, they don't think at all. So, of course, Gog, the love of power, represents the old Soviet Union, while Magog represents, in this case, the US. And here I put these images together just to make it clear in terms of their own context. Now, in 1961, Merton wrote to Cardinal that I'm deeply concerned about peace and I'm united in working with other Christians for protests against nuclear war. I do not complain, I do not criticize, but I observe with a kind of numb silence the inaction, the passivity, the apparent indifference, and the incomprehension with which most Catholics, clergy, and laity, at least in this country, watch the development of pressure that builds up to the nuclear war. Merton then said in 1962 that the mentality of the people seems to be utterly confused and stupid, that they seem to have no grasp of the real nature of the issue or its seriousness. It is a culture of well-fed zombies. How much, I wonder, have changed since then, because what we're seeing right now in the world pretty much resemble what we saw in the 1960s. So this is precisely why I thought that this topic is so relevant, because their exchange of letters and their critical stand against the madness of war, power, and greed is self-evident in what we're seeing today with the nonsense that we're seeing from Gaza to Ukraine to Sudan to you name it, to what is going on right now in the US. And of course, not to forget that Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of course, were still present in the memory of Merton and many others. Actually, I have been reading letters where he received the visit of some of the Japanese survivors at the Abbey of Gethsemane, and he actually kept the correspondence for many years, and he wanted to bear witness to that atrocity of dropping the first two nuclear atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And Merton wrote to Cardinal also in 1962 that the question is that the world is full of great criminals with enormous power, and they are in a death struggle with each other. It is a huge gun battle of supremely well-armed and well-organized gangsters using well-meaning lawyers and policemen and clergymen as their front, controlling papers, means of communication, and enrolling everybody in their armies. What can come out of it? Surely not peace. Again, is it so today? Do we have a bunch of gangsters and criminals and fellow presidents and people who are actually calling themselves peacemakers, and they want to receive a Peace Nobel Award for what? What a joke. I'm wondering what Merton will write today in our own context and what we will have to say. But in 1963, Cardinal wrote to Merton, notwithstanding the ongoing political situation, there is much vitality present in the country and an admirable spiritual fecundity. The country, meaning Nicaragua, is especially producing many young poets. Many young people in Nicaragua are becoming Marxists, but the new poets and artists that are emerging are Christians. In 1964, Merton wrote to Cardinal that we simply cannot look to the established powers and structure at the moment for any kind of constructive and living activity. All of it is rooted in the cynical greed for power and money. But Miguel and the poets have shown a genuine integrity and love, which are sane and hopeful in the extreme. And I hope that the great awakening of South America is at last about to begin, for the future belongs to South America, to Africa, to Asia, but above all, I think to South America. I will belong to North America too, but only on one condition, that the United States becomes able to learn from South and Latin America and listen to the voice that has so long been ignored. In 1965, Merton wrote to the Cardinal, however, the monumental stupidity of President Johnson's foreign policies and the crass ignorance of the State Department, I will join as soon as not be a member of an American Trappist group in a foreign country at the moment. The nonsense of Vietnam is a piece of irreparable folly, and even if Johnson gets away with as he hopes to, he cannot profit by it seriously. And this country has nothing to gain by it except the knowledge of its own inequity and stupidity. And then he writes in 1966, still active in the peace movement, but there is a sort of despair everywhere, since it's obvious that Johnson knows he's now in a position of dictatorial power and refuses to listen to anyone who does not agree with his war policy. The situation is extremely bad, and the prospects of a very large war in Asia are not unreal at all. And again, I raise the same question. Are we having people who claim to be, having this dictatorial power, authoritarian powers, tyrannical powers, or not? In the context, of course, of the war in Vietnam, and he wrote about it everywhere and to every single person that he exchanged letters with, Merton was actually thinking every single day and praying for the ongoing atrocities committed in the war in Vietnam. And he actually, of course, saw that President Johnson will get worse, not better. He was critical of Kennedy at some point, but he actually saw that at least Kennedy tried to do something with it. And if Robert F. Kennedy would have been elected and not killed, he will probably have changed the course of action in the history of humanity and in the history of the US. but clearly President Johnson wanted to keep the troops as long as he could. So in 1968, just before he died, or maybe he was killed, according to some people, including our presenter today, Hugh Tarley, and his colleague. There are many reasons why I want to leave this country, and yet for those same reasons, I think I ought to stay. It seems wrong to escape the immense rottenness, the evil, and the judgment that are inevitable here. Do you know that some fanatical Catholics in Louisville have burned my books, declaring me an atheist? An atheist, because I'm opposed to the Vietnam War. This country is mad with hatred, frustration, stupidity, and confusion. That there should be such ignorance and stupidity in a civilized land is just incomprehensible. And then in July, he wrote to Cardinal saying, I want to get out of this country. The atmosphere is stifling and very sick. Perhaps by a miracle, Eugene McCarthy might be elected. But if he's not elected, I will find it difficult to return here. This will become a police state in all reality. And again, I raise the question, is it so today? Are we seeing similar steps and moves in that direction of a more autocratic, authoritarian, and totalitarian regime or not? So in conclusion, Merton's legacy, especially in terms of his correspondence with Ernesto Cardenal, is that they share great common ground, which is, of course, they both are contemplatives, monks, they were poets, mystics, modern prophets. And in the case of Merton, he left us with wonderful writings and testimonies, but one that I love is this one. Instead of hating the people you think that are war maker, hate the appetites and the disorder in your own soul, which are the causes of war. If you live peace, then hate injustice, hate tyranny, and hate greed. But hate these things in yourself, not in one another, not in another. In the case of Cardinal, for you are not a God who is a friend of dictators, not a supporter of their politics, nor are you influenced by their propaganda. Like a lover who spends all his time thinking of his distant love, God has been thinking of me since before I was born, for all eternity. Creyeron que te enterraban y lo que hacían eran enterrar una semilla. So I welcome any comments, questions, thoughts. I put here some works in the works cited, some of the material that I use in terms of biographies and the work of Marcela Raggio in our religions special issue of mysticism and social justice, and then the work, of course, the exchange letter between Merton and Cardinal that were translated by Jesse Sandoval. I'm wondering if I can put
si hay preguntas en español o questions in English, Cristóbal can answer both. Pueden hacer las preguntas en inglés o en español.
May I, Cristóbal?
Sí.
May I, well, besides congratulating you and thanking you very, very much indeed for your forceful and very revealing talk on Merton and Cardinal, ask you to please try to elaborate a bit more on the connection between poetry and prophecy in both Merton and Cardinal. Of course, that would mean another lecture, but just a few words, because I think there is a strong connection between the spiritual, the cosmic, the social, political, the cultural, and the literary output of both Merton and Cardinal. And thank you very much again. Thank you.
So thank you, Fernando. Yeah, if you don't mind, what will be the main thing that you would like me to expand on it?
Yes, it is not only the content of the poetry of both Merton and Cardinal, but also the way they express the poetry. the way they were experimenting with language, and also in the case of Cardinal, most particularly, the way he used poetry using plain language so that it could be understood by everyone. So it was cosmic, it was literary, but it was very plain. So a peasant, a worker could easily understand what he said, both in his homilies, while in Solentinami, but also in his poetry.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think one of the most important contributions of their correspondence and friendship was precisely that because Cardinal was more a poet, born a poet, I will say, he actually influenced Merton in his experimental writings by not simply playing the canons of poetry in terms of classic style, but rather he probably pushed Merton to be more courageous and creative in terms of using a prose poetry where they can actually communicate and share not only these deep moments of contemplation and mystical encounters with the living God, but also addressing the most important social issues of the time. So I think the prose poetry is perhaps, and their experimental nature of their works, actually contributed to the enrichment of both in a way that defies language, because that was the point. The point is, how can we communicate things that are hard and complex in a way that can reach to more people, and we can have a more awakenings out there, so that the people can also contribute in their own personal way to make the world a better place. Because that's the whole bottom line, which is, where is our social responsibilities in the mess, in the context of, any wars or any human tragedies like we saw yesterday in a Catholic school in Minneapolis. I mean, for God's sake, how this can happen, to kill children inside not only a Catholic school, but while they were praying inside the church. I mean, this is incredible. And this is what Merton witnessed in the 1960s and 50s, which he saw, of course, people being blown to pieces, girls in the South, right? African American girls being blown away in Birmingham, Alabama. He wrote a beautiful poem to address these tragedies. And I think poetry can be more direct. I will say sometimes thousands of books cannot really get to your heart. Mm-hmm. If you can put a good poem in front of you, or a good song that can directly address the connection between the heart and the head and the body. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think what they tried to do. They were experimenting in a very sacramental way to see how the physical, the mental, and the spiritual can be connected, and how the contemplative can reach out to the prophetic voices in them, so that they can actually make a better contribution to the world.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Cristóbal, can you stop sharing the screen?
Let me see if I can do it.
Okay.
How can you get out of here? Let's see.
I think there is like a small square. Hay un cuadradito pequeño que dice dejar de compartir pantalla. There it is. Okay. Any other question for Cristóbal? Okay.
Hello, my name's Haley Wineslad. I'm in the UK, and I recently posted a comment in response to a post by the American political commentator Christopher Hale on his Letters from Leo page on Substack. And I asked Christopher Hale if he thought that Pope Leo's election as the first American, that is American from the United States, Pope, would overtake Thomas Merton. And Christopher Hale said yes, he would, as he put it, knock Thomas Merton off of his perch. He said the perch is too wide for the Thomas Merton. He said it would be Pope Leo would be the most well-known American religious. And my opinion, and I've written an essay about this on my own Substack account about Pope Leo, is that Pope Leo, Robert Prevost, he's actually presenting himself as Peruvian and as a Roman, as someone who's spent a lot of time also in Rome and really as a world citizen, but not as a North American United States person. And my question is, do you think that his election to the papacy, that we're going to see a lot more of Thomas Merton? I mean, he's already internationally well known, obviously, but also Thomas Merton and Cardinal. Do you think that Pope Leo's advent as Pope is going to actually promote all this further?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I mean, we don't know where this is going to lead, but clearly Pope Leo XIV is following in the footsteps of Pope Francis. And Pope Francis actually called Merton one of the four greatest American influences in the history of in the world, and with Dorothy Day, MLK, and President Lincoln. So it seems like there is a continuity between the two of them, and the fact that Pope Leo XIV lived in Latin America and knows firsthand the work of liberation theology and has friends who probably are also members in the community. And the fact that he was also born in the US, and now we know that there are a lot of lineages that people are saying that he came from even African American blood and all of that. I mean, that clearly is part of Merton's corpus, that he was a man of dialogue. And I'm pretty sure that Pope Leo XIV will continue to speak forcefully about the most important issues that Merton was addressing with Cardinal in the 1960s, which are the problems of war and peace, the problems of violence, and the madness of greed and power, which is he's doing. He's already giving speeches and condemning, the unnecessary wars and the unnecessary suffering of people around the globe, and especially in Gaza, and so on and so forth. So clearly there is a continuity, in my opinion, and I hope that he will bring Merton more to the front. But if he surpasses the popularity of Merton, I think Merton will be happy with that, because Merton was not in a contest about who is going to win or lose. What they want is simply to bear witness to truth, justice, and love. And whoever does that best, bless them.
Thank you, Cristóbal. Muchas gracias. Vamos a pasar a la próxima presentación. En español esta vez, entonces voy a usar el chat para traducir al inglés. Our next presentation is in Spanish, so I'll use the chat to translate into English. Voy a presentar entonces al doctor Leonardo Martínez. Leonardo es historiador, licenciado en Historia por la Universidad Nacional de Cuyo, máster en Historia de América por la Universidad Internacional de Andalucía y doctor en Humanidades por la Universidad Pompeu Fabra, y amigo mío de la época de estudiantes, además. Su tesis de licenciatura, presentada aquí en la Universidad Nacional de Cuyo, fue el resultado de un trabajo de investigación sobre la teología de la liberación. El doctor Martínez reside en España y es investigador independiente, interesado en la historia del arte, la música y las religiones y culturas comparadas. Dr. Leonardo Martínez is a historian who graduated from the History Department at this university, Cuyo National University, where he wrote his BA thesis on the theology of liberation. He holds an MA in History of the Americas from the University of Andalusia in Spain and a PhD from Universidad Pompeu Fabra. He resides in Spain, where he is an independent researcher interested in the arts, music, and compared religions and cultures. And he is our student day. Bueno, Leo, cierro el micrófono y podés empezar.
Bueno, hola a todos. Se me escucha bien, ¿no? Sí. Hola a todos. Muchísimas gracias, Marcela, por la invitación a participar en las jornadas. Y también muchísimas gracias a la Merton Society por el trabajo que realiza de divulgación y sobre todo de profundización en la obra de Thomas Merton, ¿no? Bueno, yo voy a intentar hoy un análisis, podríamos decir, más panorámico, ¿no? Como el título de la ponencia lo dice, ¿no? La idea es trabajar, por un lado, el catolicismo social, la obra de Merton en relación al catolicismo social y el concepto de frontera. Y me gustaría comenzar recordando un texto de Hannah Arendt, que es una colección de ensayos sobre diferentes filósofos y pensadores del siglo XX, la mayoría del mundo germánico, ¿no? Hombres en tiempos de oscuridad. Y aquí en este texto, Arendt plantea, se refiere, ¿no? A estos pensadores solitarios que van más allá del discurso trivial imperante en una época, en lo que ella llama el reino político, y que con sus vidas y sus obras iluminan la época que les toca vivir, ¿no? Y Arendt aclara que no se refiere a lo que sería una época de barbarie o monstruosidad necesariamente, sino que tiene que ver principalmente con las épocas confusas, ¿no? Entonces aquí creo que es importante y todos coincidiremos en que Thomas Merton, al margen de no pertenecer al universo germánico al que alude Arendt, es uno de estos pensadores en tiempos de oscuridad y además desde el comienzo hay una gran conciencia de época, ¿no? Y recordemos el comienzo de la autobiografía de La montaña de los siete círculos. Cito. En el último día de enero de 1915, bajo el signo de Acuario, en un año de una gran guerra y a la sombra de unas montañas francesas de la frontera con España, vine al mundo. Libre por naturaleza, a imagen de Dios, fui sin embargo prisionero de mi propia violencia y mi propio egoísmo, a imagen del mundo al cual había venido. Ese mundo era el retrato del infierno, lleno de hombres como yo, amantes de Dios y no obstante aborreciéndolo, nacidos para amarle y viviendo en cambio con temor y desesperadas apetencias antagónicas. Y aquí tenemos, por supuesto, la descripción de la época en la que él nace, que de alguna manera anticipa todo lo que sigue, ¿no? Ustedes saben, Primera Guerra Mundial, la lucha ideológica de los años 30, la Segunda Guerra Mundial, lo que será el Holocausto, la bomba atómica en Hiroshima y Nagasaki, y es el marco en el cual Merton transcurre una gran parte de su vida hasta la llegada a la abadía de Getsemaní, que es 1941, el momento en el cual se está llevando a cabo la guerra mundial. Este papel de Merton como iluminador, para usar los términos de Hannah Arendt, hay que situarlo dentro del contexto de lo que se conoce como capitalismo social. El capitalismo social, y voy a hacer una definición básica y muy grosera, tendría que ver con un activismo católico que se ejerce dentro de la realidad mundana. El término se populariza tímidamente después de la Rerum Novarum, pero por otro lado, al margen de la novedad que pueda aparecer, tiene que ver con un tema que toca a la Iglesia desde el comienzo, que es la dialéctica entre la Iglesia y el mundo. Es un tema que es una dialéctica que está presente, como digo, desde el comienzo de la historia de la Iglesia, con la diferencia que durante el primer siglo de esa historia, hay una sensación en los creyentes, ¿no? De una inminencia de la segunda llegada de Cristo y por lo tanto hay una actitud de mayor distancia frente al mundo existente, y a partir del siglo IV, Constantino y luego Teodosio, la Iglesia se superpone a toda la estructura del Imperio Romano, es lo que se denomina la cristiandad o la Iglesia constantiniana, y a partir de aquí la tensión escatológica se reduce frente a la definición de la presencia de la Iglesia en el mundo y de la importancia que la Iglesia tiene que jugar en un mundo que ya, y me refiero evidentemente al mundo europeo, ¿no? Que ya es, que está siendo total, o en apariencia totalmente cristianizado. A partir de 1789, la Revolución Francesa, como saben, hay un cambio, se produce hay un avance, hay una radicalización en el proceso de secularismo. El mundo moderno va a tomar como referencia otros valores, el mito del progreso, el mito de la democracia, el mito de la revolución, la lógica del individualismo, la del racionalismo, la del materialismo. Y frente a ello, el papado y la iglesia, que van a ser uno de los grandes bestias negras, ¿no? De los secularistas, ¿no? Ya desde el siglo XVIII, se aferrará de alguna manera al mito de la cristiandad y se producirá un endurecimiento de sus posiciones teológicas y todas las implicaciones políticos sociales, ¿no? Aclaro que estoy usando mito en el sentido de imagen o idea fuerza. No estoy usando mito en el sentido de fábula o una especie de leyenda, ¿no? Lo uso en un sentido más cercano a lo arquetípico. Y aquí tenemos el concepto definido por el Concilio de Trento, de sociedad perfecta, que definiría a la Iglesia, frente a toda esta modernidad que evidentemente se construye en un conflicto con la Iglesia cristiana. ¿Qué ocurre con aquellos cristianos que de alguna manera no se van a situar en la línea de ruptura, sino que van a intentar situarse en la frontera? Y aquí tenemos, a grosso modo, podríamos decir, dos posiciones. Por un lado, la del AMNE, que tiene que ver con 1830, 1850, tiene que ver con una asimilación del mundo moderno, un mayor reclamo de adecuar la Iglesia a este mundo moderno, y aquí tenemos el comienzo de lo que se llama el catolicismo liberal. Incluso se produce también una deriva hacia el socialismo en la obra de Lamné de sus últimos años, y él llega a proclamar la posibilidad de un cristianismo sin iglesia. Aquí tendríamos el prototipo de un cristiano revolucionario. En cambio, hay otra actitud, que es la del cardenal Newman, John Henry Newman, una figura clave del movimiento, que va a plantear la adecuación del dogma a los tiempos. Aquí hay un concepto que es el concepto de desarrollo doctrinal, y Newman lo que plantea no es que el dogma tiene que cambiar, sino que el dogma ya contiene elementos que pueden permitir de alguna manera responder a la situación que está generando la irrupción del mundo moderno. Este planteo de Newman es muy importante porque es la base del catolicismo social. Ese catolicismo social comienza a tomar forma y tendrá un gran impulso a partir de la Rerum Novarum, que como saben se considera el punto de partida de la doctrina social de la Iglesia. Y aquí hay que hablar de un cambio, de esa política de confrontación línea dura que principalmente él había liderado Pío IX, ¿no? Y que se había concretado en la proclamación del dogma de la infalibilidad papal en el Vaticano I, que por otro lado fue un concilio que no alcanzó a terminarse. Aquí en León XIII vemos un desplazamiento hacia una posición que podríamos denominar diálogo controlado. La jerarquía va a controlar a los grupos vinculados a este catolicismo social que toma forma. Hay casos como el de el Silón, ¿no? En Francia, que tendrá finalmente una condena por parte de la Iglesia, pero por otro lado hay casos que ya nos llevan a una red de asociaciones sociales, de asociaciones culturales, y aquí ya hay que hablar del surgimiento del sindicalismo católico o de partidos como el Partido del Centrum en Alemania. En el siglo XX, esta línea de diálogo controlado se mantiene, pero, y aquí es interesante situarnos en el contexto de los años 30 y 40, al margen de lo que sería la línea oficial, hay una serie de debates internos dentro de la Iglesia, teólogos, filósofos, activistas, que marcan también un cambio de perspectiva. Y todos estos debates coinciden, si tomamos como base la década del 30 y llegamos hasta mediados de los 50, con la etapa de Merton, ingresando a primero su etapa juvenil, después el ingreso a Getsemaní y después lo que será el mayor compromiso, bueno, el comienzo de su compromiso, diríamos, con el mundo político y social a finales de los años 50. Aquí habría que hablar, y menciono así al pasar, porque evidentemente el tema da para más, por ejemplo, la reivindicación de Maritain de crear una nueva cristiandad, la idea de el rechazo al confesionalismo por personajes como Emmanuel Mounier, ¿no? Que va a plantear la idea del personalismo comunitario, contextos finales de la posguerra, que supone un diálogo incluso con sectores que no pertenecen a la Iglesia Católica, y la idea de diáspora cristiana de Runner, formulada en los años 50. Todos estos debates internos, muy controlados y sometidos al control de la jerarquía, sin embargo, confluyen en el Concilio Vaticano II. En el Concilio Vaticano hay una asunción de precisamente la tesis del cardenal Newman, la idea de ir al dogma para explicar, para buscar una respuesta de la Iglesia al mundo contemporáneo. La idea de Iglesia como sociedad perfecta es reemplazada o diríamos puesta subordinada en la lógica del concilio al concepto de iglesia, pueblo de Dios. Recuerden los elementos de los documentos conciliares, es un concilio pastoral, no se plantea una redefinición de la doctrina, la colegialidad de los obispos, el mayor reconocimiento de los laicos, la posibilidad de reforma de la liturgia, la reivindicación de una misión para la Iglesia del mundo, que esto dará lugar a la encíclica Pacem in Terris de Juan XXIII, la asunción del ecumenismo y la aceptación de la libertad religiosa y el concepto de semilla de verdad que permite evidentemente una actitud de diálogo con tradiciones que no vienen del mundo cristiano. Toda esta época de optimismo polémico, sabemos que el Concilio Vaticano generó muchos debates en su momento, daría lugar después a todo el posconcilio, con un mayor aumento de la experimentación, de la radicalidad de posiciones y concretamente en Europa, en la Europa occidental, la confrontación con un mayor nivel de secularismo y en América Latina con un mayor nivel de politización. Y esto evidentemente el concilio se convierte en un gran impulso para el catolicismo social. La pregunta, ¿dónde queda Merton en este panorama, no? Y aquí es interesante recapitular la vida de Merton, ¿no? La conocen, ¿no? La conocemos, pero bueno, creo que vale la pena. Primero, hablamos del ingreso a Getsemaní, 1941, la publicación de La montaña de los siete círculos, 1948, a impulsos de su director espiritual y de la autoridad de la abadía, con un nombre secular, una obra que tendrá un gran éxito de ventas, es uno de los grandes bestsellers espirituales del siglo XX, y eso convierte a Thomas Merton en un referente de la espiritualidad contemporánea, con un peso en la opinión pública católica, pero también con una influencia en sectores no católicos. Un ejemplo, Gary Schneider, poeta vinculado al Renacimiento de San Francisco y a la llamada generación Beat, va a reconocer en la montaña de los siete círculos un impulso para entrar en la vía monacal. Claro, en el caso de Schneider la opción será por el budismo. La década que sigue a la publicación de La montaña de los siete círculos es una década donde Merton escribe ensayos, artículos, poemas, crea una red epistolar con intelectuales dentro y fuera del catolicismo, será maestro de los postulantes, es ordenado sacerdote, está la tensión entre la vida comunitaria y la vida eremítica, ¿no? Esta duda intermitente sobre trasladarse a la cartuja. Es decir, estamos dentro del marco de la vida de un monje, búsquedas espirituales, búsquedas intelectuales como monje escritor. Llegamos al 58, la epifanía de Louisville. Cito: de repente me abrumó darme cuenta, esta experiencia que Merton vive en la calle, de que amaba a toda esa gente, de que todos eran míos y yo de ellos, de que no podíamos ser extraños unos a otros, aunque no nos conociéramos en absoluto. Fue como despertar de un sueño de separación, de falso aislamiento en un mundo especial, el mundo de la renuncia y de la supuesta santidad. Si por lo menos nos viéramos unos a otros así todo el tiempo, no habría más guerra, ni más odio, ni más crueldad, ni más codicia. La puerta del cielo está en todas partes. Repito, la puerta del cielo está en todas partes. La epifanía de Louisville genera un cambio, ¿no? Hay un desplazamiento del monje escritor a monje escritor profético o profeta directamente, perdón, profeta en el mundo contemporáneo. En su escritura aparecen temas de actualidad, no hay una ruptura con la temática anterior, sino hay que verlo como una prolongación, diríamos una mundanización de la misma, y lo de mundanización entre comillas. Y evidentemente sin la obra espiritual de Merton no podemos entender toda su obra política o profética. ¿Cómo entiende él profetizar? Cito de nuevo: captar la realidad en su momento de suprema expectación y tensión hacia lo nuevo. Esta tensión se descubre no en un entusiasmo hipnótico, sino a la luz de la existencia diaria. Entonces aquí tenemos al Merton profético que se va a integrar dentro de toda esta frontera del catolicismo social. Está la cuestión, que ya lo comentaron anteriormente, de la censura de la autoridad de la abadía sobre algunos de sus escritos, una censura que se va a flexibilizar o desaparecer en algún caso después de la publicación de Pacem in Terris, que deja a Merton como un precursor o como alguien que está en la misma línea de lo que está proclamando Juan XXIII. Y en este momento Merton comienza a encarnar en este periodo que va del final del pontificado de Pío XII, pero sobre todo el pontificado de Juan XXIII y el comienzo del de Pablo VI, todo lo que será el ayornamiento, ¿no? Recuerden lo que dice en el prólogo a la edición japonesa de su autobiografía, donde habla de que rechazo a las injusticias raciales, las tiranías económicas, el aparato socioeconómico, ¿no? Su silencio como protesta contra las mentiras de los políticos, de las propagandistas y de los agitadores. Si nosotros tomamos la temática de sus artículos, y lo hemos visto en la ponencia anterior, vemos la presencia de esta agenda contemporánea, el movimiento por la paz mundial contra las armas nucleares, el activismo contra la intervención estadounidense en Vietnam, la campaña por los derechos civiles, la condena del racismo, la reivindicación de la no violencia, la crítica de la lógica individualista y consumista de la sociedad contemporánea. Agreguemos el ecumenismo, agreguemos el estudio del mundo del budismo, que es clave para Merton en su diálogo con las culturas orientales, y tampoco dejemos de lado los diálogos con sectores que no pertenecen al mundo católico y que incluso tienen una religiosidad bastante poco convencional. Pensemos en la contracultura beat, en el Renacimiento de San Francisco, personajes como Ferlinghetti, o la publicación de los poemas de Kerouac en su revista, la del 68, Monk's Pond. Incluso Lenny Bruce, que era un controvertido humorista de la época, va a usar un poema de Merton, Canto para ser utilizado en procesiones alrededor de un lugar con hornos, para referirse al Holocausto. Esto habla del nivel de difusión de su obra. Merton, en este sentido, es crucial, es un personaje de referencia en la opinión pública en estos años. No hay que situarlo, creo, en el terreno de una revolución política o social puramente terrenal o inmanente. Tiene que ver con la conciencia, con la renovación de los espíritus, con la llamada a la conversión. Al margen de alguna duda puntual o la crisis de 1966, él no se va a plantear dejar Getsemaní, sino que en todo caso se trata, y vuelvo a Hannah Arendt, de iluminar desde el monasterio. Y aquí podríamos pensar en una figura de la orden del Cister, San Bernardo de Claraval o de Clairvaux, que es un personaje que también va a jugar un papel en su época, con un enorme peso político, con un enorme peso teológico. Hay similitudes entre ambos, la obra de Merton es más fragmentaria, el peso teológico es distinto, ¿no? Ambos son personajes que se van a situar en la frontera entre el monasterio y el mundo, pero hay diferencias muy significativas. San Bernardo venía de una familia cristiana y pertenece al mundo de la caballería medieval. Merton es, detalle sumamente importante, un converso. Ninguno de sus padres era católico, el padre era un pintor y un bohemio, un hombre que al parecer tenía alguna creencia cristiana difusa. La madre venía de la tradición cuáquera, es decir, antitrinitaria y antieclesial, la reforma dentro de la reforma. Y pensemos en la trayectoria de Merton, la fascinación por los íconos bizantinos, la lectura de la Biblia, la asistencia a servicios religiosos de diferentes corrientes del cristianismo, luego los años de Cambridge y la Bohemia, en Colombia el flirteo con el comunismo, la fascinación por el espíritu de la Edad Media de Gilson. Este libro le abre una puerta hacia la mística cristiana. La exploración de Merton continúa. La tesis sobre William Blake, un visionario esotérico, ¿no? Heterodoxo por totalmente. El bautismo católico tras el impacto de la lectura de la conversión de Gerard Manley Hopkins, miembro del movimiento de Oxford, vinculado a John Henry Newman. El proyecto de tesis doctoral de Merton sobre Hopkins, un viaje a Cuba, la experiencia de la presencia divina durante una misa, la fallida solicitud de ingreso a la orden franciscana, el trabajo social en la Friendship House de Harlem, la atracción por la trapa y finalmente Getsemaní. Merton ya pertenecía a la frontera antes de ser un monje. El derrotero de Merton es fascinante, su derrotero vital. Eso explica el éxito de la montaña de los 7 círculos. Esto nos lleva a otra gran figura, al autor de otra gran autobiografía, San Agustín. Y aquí es interesante también compararlos, porque mientras San Agustín se va a convertir después de la conversión en el defensor de la ortodoxia doctrinal, Merton tendrá una actitud mucho más flexible. San Agustín defiende un cristianismo que considera amenazado por el paganismo y la herejía, mientras que Merton se va a enfrentar a un mundo secularizado y amenazado por la bomba nuclear. San Agustín encarna la iglesia en ascenso y triunfal, esa llamada iglesia de Constantino, y Merton la iglesia que proclama renunciar al poder temporal en beneficio de la proclamación del Evangelio, la del Vaticano II. San Agustín deja el monasterio para dirigir la iglesia institucional y Merton se mantiene dentro de la iglesia profética y le exige un mayor nivel de profecía. Los dos, coincidencia enorme, viven en una época de mutación histórica. San Agustín frente al final de Roma y Merton en toda esta transición incierta de lo que es la Guerra Fría. Decimos que el derrotero de Merton es fascinante, pero hay algo más. Decimos que cumple su papel de hombre en tiempos de oscuridad, recuerden a Arendt, desde la frontera del cristianismo, desde el catolicismo social, pero hay algo más. En Acción y Contemplación, estos escritos publicados después de su muerte, nos da una clave. Cito: descubrimos nuestra identidad cuando aceptamos nuestro lugar y nuestro camino en medio de las personas y las cosas, en una situación histórica que no tenemos que comprender completamente. Simplemente vemos que este es nuestro propio lugar y decidimos vivir en él para bien o para mal. Es decir, aceptar el propio lugar y decidir vivir en él. Está claro, ¿no? Pero ese propio lugar, la frontera, es más que el lugar donde el monje escritor profeta Merton quiere vivir o decide vivir. Hay algo más todavía y Merton nos da la clave definitiva, la intuición que incluso ilumina de otra manera lo que significa habitar en la frontera. Y vuelvo a citar a Merton en Acción y Contemplación. En otras palabras, soy un hombre en el mundo moderno. De hecho, soy el mundo al igual que vosotros. ¿Dónde voy a empezar a buscar el mundo si no es en sí mismo? Entonces Merton se nos revela cómo el mundo, como la propia frontera, y con él arrastra en esa autorrevelación al catolicismo social, a la misma iglesia y al cristianismo. Es un desplazamiento terminológico sutil, pasar de habitar a ser, pero es definitorio, porque con esto Merton salta de la dinámica de su propia época hacia el corazón del misterio y nos deja a todos hecho frontera. La frontera, como diría Pascal, que existe entre la nada y el infinito. Muchas gracias. Y perdón por excederme con el tiempo y perdón, Marcela, por el trabajo.
Muchas gracias, Leo. Bueno, no sé si hay preguntas, questions. I have tried to summarize what Leo was saying in the chat. If you want to ask in English, I can translate. Y los que quieran preguntar en español, también. Sí, Cristóbal.
Sí, ¿me escuchan ahora?
Sí.
Gracias. Sí, sí, muchas gracias, Leonardo, por tu estupenda presentación. Cuando hablabas de la censura y sobre todo del tema de, de- de que Merton no le permitieron continuar con su escrito sobre la guerra y la paz, incluso después de la publicación de la encíclica, él continuó sin poder publicar oficialmente esos escritos. Tenía siempre que buscar, como él bien dice en muchos de sus diarios, mm, publicaciones pequeñas y artículos donde él no fuese tan notorio y tan público, porque si no, no le permitían incluso mandar más escritos a otras amistades que él tenía en su círculo. Pero el hecho de que se convirtiese en ermita, ¿no crees que el silencio también no solamente es positivo en términos de intimidad con la presencia divina, pero puede ser muy negativo como otra forma de censura? Y que en este caso claramente la intención fue también quitárselo del medio para que no tuviese esa notoriedad y esa difusión que tú bien hablabas durante tu presentación. O sea, mi pregunta realmente es, ¿cuál es el problema del lenguaje del silencio cuando jugamos con esta dialéctica entre silencio contemplativo y silencio para torturar y censurar al prójimo?
Bueno, Cristóbal, gracias por los comentarios. Mira, yo creo que aquí hay un tema interesante porque por un lado está Merton mismo, ¿no? Que según he leído en su biografía, en sus biografías, ¿no? Va a buscar la opción eremítica en varios momentos puntuales de su vida en el monasterio. Y después está esta situación de que finalmente acceden a otorgarle el lugar como ermita, como decís vos, ¿no? Quedamos en la duda si es un silencio reflexivo, contemplativo, o si era una forma de callarlo. Creo que hay un detalle ahí interesante. Creo que la duda va a ser imposible dilucidarla porque, claro, Merton muere en el 68. No sabemos qué hubiera ocurrido si Merton hubiera sobrevivido 2 o 3 décadas más, ¿no? Él corresponde a esta etapa más, diríamos, optimista del posconcilio y además corresponde a un cambio de abad, que es el que le va a permitir el viaje asiático. Entonces yo creo que aquí, de alguna forma, si nosotros consideramos al viaje asiático que es el viaje final, el único y el final. Pero si lo consideramos como una excepción dentro de lo que hubiera sido lo que vendría después, evidentemente el silencio tiene que ver con una cuestión de disciplina. Pero si el viaje asiático era el comienzo de un Merton al que se le permitía interactuar, incluso físicamente, con el mundo existente y en el contexto de todo lo que será la reforma monástica del posconcilio, claro, aquí evidentemente nos entraríamos al silencio creativo y al silencio en una dialéctica con esa presencia en el mundo activo, ¿no? Creo que la muerte de Merton nos deja lamentablemente en la gran incertidumbre de qué es lo que estaba finalmente ocurriendo, ¿no?
Gracias, Leo. No sé si hay más preguntas. Any other question? Okay, so we'll go to the next presentation, which is the last in the morning session. La próxima presentación, que es la última de la mañana, está a cargo de Paul Pynkoski. Ya lo presenté antes, pero ahora lo voy a presentar más formalmente. So the last presentation of this morning session is by Paul Pynkoski. I introduced him earlier, but now I will go over a more detailed presentation. Paul Pynkoski, presidente de la International Thomas Merton Society, fue inspirado por Merton para fundar Voces por la Paz, que es un grupo ecuménico. Paul tiene un interés especial por la intersección entre la espiritualidad, el arte y la justicia social. Recientemente se ha unido a Board of Sanctuary, una comunidad que busca alternativas de construcción de vivienda para los sin techo. Paul Pynkoski is the president of the International Thomas Merton Society. Inspired by Merton, he started Voices for Peace, an ecumenical conference on nonviolence. He is interested in the intersection of spirituality, social justice, and the arts. He recently joined the Board of Sanctuary, a community with a vision of building supportive housing for unhoused people. Well, thank you again, Paul.
Thank you, Marcela, and thank you, Dominiek, Cristóbal, and Leo, for what you brought forward already, particularly the emphasis on content and continuity, and Cristóbal for your attention to the madness and violence of our context. And I think we're going to overlap a little bit here, but in a good way. So, Canadian singer-songwriter Bruce Cockburn tells a story about the poet Pablo Neruda during the military coup in Chile in 1973. The secret police had rounded up, incarcerated, and tortured many artists and writers. They broke into Neruda's house and began to search it. Neruda said to them, "Look around. There's only one thing here of danger for you: poetry." The story became part of the inspiration for Cockburn's song, Maybe the Poet. And he offers, maybe the poet is gay, but he'll be heard anyway. Maybe he's a woman who can touch you where you're human. Maybe you and he will not agree, but you need him to show you new ways to see. And then he warns, don't let the system fool you. All it wants to do is rule you. Poet has the potential to open our imaginations, to disrupt our usual ways of seeing, hearing, and being in the world, rejecting the domination of the status quo, to the existing political order, whether capitalist, fascist, or communist. This is dangerous. And the experience that Cockburn captures in this song rings true in our current circumstances some 40 years later. Theologians Sylvia Kiesmat and Brian Walsh affirm this idea. Empires and oppressors, they write, quote, maintain their sovereignty by monopolizing the imagination of their subjects. But as long as their subjects harbor dreams of a social reality alternative to the empire, they are a threat to the empire. They assert the Apostle Paul's poem in Colossians, the one that begins, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation," applies to Jesus Christ, images and language reserved solely for Caesar, and aims to reshape the imagination of the early Christian community. Thomas Merton's poem, Hagia Sophia, has been described as Marian poetry and as mystical poetry. I want to suggest that it fits into the category of dangerous and subversive poetry. When read alongside Merton's letter to Pablo Antonio Quadra concerning giants, which sits beside Hagia Sophia in Merton's poetry collection, Emblems in a Season of Fury, its subversive qualities become more apparent. I want to look briefly at the world Merton describes and critiques in the letter. I will then explore the world Merton envisions in Hagia Sophia and how it subverts the world of the letter. Finally, I want to explore briefly the contours of a spirituality of encounter and resistance that can be discerned when we consider the Hagia Sophia and letter together. Merton and Pablo Antonio Quadra were shaped by the violence of 20th century conflicts. Quadra, a Nicaraguan poet, essayist, and political activist, lived through the era when the Sandinista rebels were attempting to overthrow the Somoza dictatorship, and at one point had to flee to safety in Costa Rica. World War I caused Merton's family to flee France for the USA. He entered the Abbey of Gethsemane just as the USA entered World War II. His younger brother died in that war. It was the era of the atomic bomb and Cold War politics. Merton had also seen in Harlem the poverty that resulted in the USA from the violence of racism. Merton and Quadra corresponded for a decade. The letter, however, is actually an essay. Merton told Quadra he felt compelled to make a statement about the Cold War and Latin America, but could say it better if I knew the person I was addressing. Quadra published the letter in translation in his magazine El Pez y la Serpentin in March of 1962. There is an edge to Merton's voice from the very outset of the essay. The anger of the opening paragraph feels comparable to the Hebrew prophets. He speaks of the discordant voices of modern society, the vertigo of the 20th century, and of a tornado and a whirlwind in a world marked by the presence of stool pigeons, torturers, and concentration camps. Merton criticizes the emptiness of technological man, who spends billions of weapons on weapons of destruction and space rockets when he cannot provide decent meals, shelter, and clothing for 2/3 of the human race. Scientists and engineers are condemned for using their skills to develop weapons that emerge from the dark dreams of humanity's idolatry, of greed and violence. He insists the worst of humanity has become objectified in society, approved, acclaimed, and deified, and that politics has become deception. Nations are seized by a sort of collective madness set on destroying one another, believing peace can come through destruction and love can prevail by killing those you hate. Western arrogance has caused the destruction of the indigenous cultures of the Americas, India, and Africa. Merton employs the images of the warring factions of Gog and Magog from Ezekiel and the Apocalypse, drawing them forward to represent Russia and the USA. He characterizes Gog's sin as an idolatry of power and Magog's as an idolatry of money. And we heard earlier that he wrote the same thing to Ernesto Cardenal. He notes the ease with which anyone can be labeled enemy or criminal, and their incarceration, torture, and disappearance arranged. Neither power is dedicated to concrete relations of man to man, but only to abstractions about politics, economics, psychology, and religion. He predicts a dark future, suggesting the very serious possibility that Gog and Magog may wake up one morning to find they have blasted each other off the planet during the night and nothing will remain. After dispatching the essay to Quadra, Merton wrote in his journal, "The letter I wrote last week is bitter and unjust. It lacks perspective. It cannot do much good to anyone in its present shape." 60-some years after its publication, however, Merton's observations and reflections seem almost tame. Civil war in Sudan, genocides in Bosnia, Rwanda, and Gaza, the USA's invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the renewal of the nuclear arms race, creeping fascism, climate change and the extinction of species, the crisis of homelessness, examples of violence and dehumanization seem almost endless. Yet Merton also spoke of hope rooted in the incarnation, and we'll return to this a little bit later. Turn our attention now to Hagia Sophia. Who can forget the impact of hearing the opening lines of Hagia Sophia for the first time? I quote, "There is in all visible things an invisible fecundity, a dimmed light, a meek namelessness, a hidden wholeness. This mystery and unity and integrity is wisdom, the mother of all. Natura naturans. There is in all things an inexhaustible sweetness and purity, a silence that is a fount of action and joy. It rises up in wordless gentleness and flows out to me from the unseen roots of all created being, welcoming me tenderly, saluting me with indescribable humility. This at once is my own being, my own nature, and the gift of my Creator's thought and art within me, speaking as Hagia Sophia, speaking as my sister, wisdom. I am awakened, I am born again at the voice of this, my sister, sent to me from the depths of the divine fecundity." Merton's lyrical and musical voice invites us to envision an entirely different reality. Careful study by Christopher Pramick, Susan McCaslin, and Donald St. John identify a wide range of influences that shaped Merton's imagination prior to the poem's birth. 4 Russian Orthodox theologians who explored the images of Wisdom Sophia found in scripture, iconography, and Eastern theology. Merton's dream life, feminine images from scripture explored by Bernard of Clairvaux in 14th century mystics. Carl Stern's book, Flight from Women, and Merton's studies in Zen. These influences converged over a period of 2 or 3 years in the late 1950s, but never went beyond entries in Merton's journals. Sophia, at this point, had not taken full shape. 2 encounters were key to Merton's weaving these influences into poetry. While having lunch with Victor and Carolyn Hammer, the figures in the central panel of a triptych painted by Victor sparked a question. A woman was placing a crown on the head of a young boy, and Merton asked Hammer who she was. Hammer's response was that the figure had changed several times in the course of painting, so he did not know. Merton immediately responded that she was Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom, who crowns Christ. Hammer wrote to Merton afterwards and asked for more information about Sophia. The question pushed Merton to put into words what had been in his imagination unarticulated. Portions of Merton's response appear verbatim in the poem. Then in late June 1960, Merton was hospitalized. In his journal entry of July 2, 1960, he writes, "At 5:30, as I was dreaming, in a very quiet hospital, the soft voice of the nurse awoke me gently from my dream, as if the Blessed Virgin herself, as if wisdom had awakened me. The encounter with the voice of a nurse became the last piece of this complex puzzle, and it too is recounted in the poem." Hagia Sophia was completed in early 1961. A limited edition publication of the poem was adorned with a woodcut of the central figure from Hammer's triptych. Hagia Sophia is built around the cycle of an ordinary day. Merton employed similar structures in Rain and the Rhinoceros, and in Day of a Stranger. What sets Hagia Sophia apart is Merton's identification of each section of the poem with both the time of day and the name of one of the monastic prayer offices. It signals to us that this is a prayer as much as it is poetry. The opening section is called Dawn, the Hour of Lauds. Merton navigates certain in mystery as he introduces the figure of Sophia. He affirms the reality of Sophia's presence in creation with a repetition of this is, there is, or this is on 4 occasions. As the poet sleeps, the touch of a nurse's hand awakens him, and we shift to the realm of mystery. The affirmation there is replaced by the repetition of it is like. A kaleidoscope of images rush from his pen, overlapping, shifting, converging. The awakening of the poet becomes the one Christ, awakening in all separate selves, and expands to include the creation of Adam and his resurrection on the last day. The nurse is variously wisdom, Eve, the Blessed Virgin, and the Spirit. The poet's awakening sweeps us through creation, incarnation, and the consummation of all things, inviting us to inhabit a world that is infused with the Creator's gift of wisdom, showing herself as gentleness, mercy, and love. It is the antithesis of the dehumanizing forces of Gog and Magog. Do we have eyes to see and ears to hear? Sitting beneath the surface of Merton's melodic song to Sophia is a harmony of resistance. Sunday lauds at Gethsemane included the singing of the Benedicite. The canticle calls on all creatures, weather, the sea, and the whole of the universe to sing the Creator's praise. Merton loved to sing it outdoors at the Hermitage. He writes, "Here, lauds is harmony with the singing birds under the bright sky. Everything you have on your lips in praising God is here before you. Hill, dew, light, birds, growing things. In the middle of the Benedicite, the great presence of the sun, which has just risen from behind the cedars. And now under the pines, the sun has made a great golden basilica of fire and water." I hear echoes of the canticle in the opening lines of Hagia Sophia and in Merton's reference to the first morning of the world in paradise. In its biblical setting in the book of Daniel, the Benedicite was sung by 3 Hebrew men after they were condemned to death by fire for not worshiping the emperor. It is a song then of resistance to the powers of Babylon, and by extension to Rome, Nazi Germany, to Gog and to Magog. As we move through the next 2 sections, prime and tierce, Merton dares to speak of God as both feminine and masculine, names Sophia as the ousia of the Trinity, the child in each of us, our sister, the unseen pivot of all nature, bride, feast, and wedding. Merton then laments, "We do not see, we do not hear. Sometimes there are none who know her at all. Yet even there the old order is subverted, as Sophia, oblivious to imprisonment, continues her work of awakening, not the conquest and dark pleasure, but the pure simplicity of one consciousness in all, enticing us to make a new world." In the last section, sunset, the hour of Compline, Salve Regina. In the hour of Compline, Sophia is present in Mary's consent for her womb to be the place of God's new creation, opening the door of created nature, of time, of history, to the Word of God. Through Mary, she is a participant in our redemption, crowning the Logos with his human nature and sending him forth in his mission of inexpressible mercy to die for us on the cross. Sophia, through Mary, points us to Christ. The specific reference to Salve Regina in this section underscores this. The hymn has been sung for centuries in Cistercian abbeys at the Liturgy of Compline. It is a prayer addressed to Mary, Mother of Mercy, our life, our sweetness, and our hope, asking that she show us the blessed fruit of your womb, Jesus. At the Abbey of Gethsemane, as Salve Regina was sung, the lights of the chapel were extinguished, leaving at the end a single candle illuminating an icon of Mary. She holds in her arms the Christ child, and her right hand is lifted pointing to Christ. The Christ Sophia gestures to as the poem ends is the one who comes in weakness, nothingness, and poverty. We encounter a vagrant, a destitute wanderer with dusty feet, a homeless God who lies down at the side of the road and, like the poet, entrusts himself to sleep. We don't find in Hagia Sophia any mention of the vertigo, whirlwind, and storm of the letter that leads to dehumanization, violence, and war. What we find instead is a poet enticing us towards the underlying reality of Sophia, holy wisdom, revealed as tenderness and mercy, suffused throughout creation. Sophia, though hidden, is an active presence. She dances with the triune God, and through her presence in creation, she rises up in wordless gentleness and flows out to me, to us. She comes forth, reaching from end to end mightily, and does in us a work greater than that of creation, the work of new being and grace. Through the incarnation, Sophia upends the human arrogance of the West and its cerebral and mechanistic culture, so bent on destroying the wisdom cultures of the Mayans, Hindus, and Indians. She overcomes division through humility, weakness, and poverty, drawing everything into unity of love. Through Merton, though Merton affirms her gentle and merciful presence in creation, the fullness of our awakening to Sophia is rooted in our attention to the human. In the letter, hope for the future lies in our openness to encounter Christ in the other, the stranger, in the faith that God became man and can be seen in man, that he can speak in man, and that he can enlighten and inspire love in and through any man I meet. We must find him in our enemy, or we may lose him in our friend. We must find him in the pagan, or we will lose him in ourselves. Merton is more concrete in Hagia Sophia. It is the actual touch and voice of a particular nurse in a particular Louisville hospital at 5:30 a.m. on a particular morning that awakens him to Sophia's invitation to wisdom and love. It is the actuality of Mary's consent that opens the door of created nature, of time, of history to the Word of God. And in the end, it is through an actual vagrant with dusty feet that we encounter the mercy of the homeless God. These specific and concrete human encounters subvert the death-dealing abstractions humanity embraces. We can discern here the contours of a spirituality of encounter, not theoretical encounter, but actual, that grounds and integrates our contemplative life and our activism for peace and justice. By its four-part structure of monastic offices and its allusions to the canticles of resistance and incarnation, the poem insists on the centrality of prayer to our awakening to Sophia. It is prayer of the whole person, fed by scripture, art, music, and poetry. It is a spirituality that gives priority to the feminine in voice and in imagery. It is at home with mystery. The multiple sources in Hagia Sophia and the multiple cultures noted in the letter suggest it is a spirituality that is fundamentally curious and willing to cross boundaries. It is a spirituality that is deeply incarnational. Quadra, Merton speaks of, and I quote, the Christ that was born among the Indians many centuries ago, who manifested himself in the Indian culture before the coming of official Christianity. Sophia points to Christ in Mary's womb, on the cross, and among exiles and refugees. There is nowhere where Christ is not found. Finally, it is a spirituality that is rooted in direct and humble human encounter. In the letter, Merton encourages engagement with other cultures, communities, and religions. In Hagia Sophia, encounters with persons become moments of revelation and transformation. It is a subversive spirituality because it opposes power politics in favor of dialogue and rejects false nationalisms and cultural caricatures, preferencing unity over division. It is countercultural, preferring the company of the least of these, who are hungry, thirsty, sick, or in prison, to proximity to the powerful. Merton, in offering this poetic vision, issues a challenge. We can embrace the reality of Gog and Magog, ultimately awakening to find we have blasted each other off the map, or we can awaken to the reality of Sophia, allowing love to take us by the hand and open to us the doors of another life, another day. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Are there any questions, comments?
Marcela, hello, everybody.
Hi, Chris.
Hello, it's good to see everybody. Paul, thank you. That was really lovely, really wonderful, thoughtful. I especially appreciated your opening salvo around how the poet, the artist, can be a dangerous figure for people in authority, and you only have to think of our current president taking over the Kennedy Center and trying to control the levers of artistic representation. And that's kind of the heart of my question for you. You've kind of, and not only you, but others have talked about the power of poetry and imagination as a realm of hopefulness. And yet it can also be utilized, right, by the powers of music, poetry, precisely because it appeals to our imagination so powerfully. The symbols of poetry, the symbols of the flag, the symbols of even the person of Jesus, as we saw on January 6th, right? The flag with the name of Jesus right next to the name of Trump while they're attacking the Capitol, you know. So how do you negotiate in your own mind kind of both the dark side and of imagination and poetry with or the arts with its potential for cultivating, galvanizing hope in people?
It's a tough question, Chris. A good question. I think I defer to Sylvia Keysmat and Brian Walsh in some way. In their commentary on Colossians, they talk about how when you walk through those cities in the Roman world, you were confronted everywhere with symbols. So of the statues of the emperor, engravings about battles. The emperor was on the coin, which of course Jesus knew when he took and said to his questioners, whose face is on this coin? Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. So there's it's everywhere. So I think as people of faith, um, as Sylvia and Brian suggested, that part of the pushback, part of the subversiveness is to take hold of those symbols, take them back, or to create new symbols and new images that provide the opportunity, that invite us into a different sort of reality. I don't know. Coburn was very he wasn't particularly sold on the idea that a song could convert somebody. But I think that if, as people of faith, we're able in our liturgy, in poetry, in song, in our art. I think of Becky McIntyre and Sarah Fulla's art for the Catholic Worker, that we can create possibilities to rethink, to reframe, to tell the story of mercy and love and equality, and point towards the God that Merton pointed towards within our communities. But I think it's encouraged by that we need to walk out into our communities and act in ways that affirm or push back against the darkness and the empire's use of the symbols and the flag, and the bringing co-opting Jesus. We need to push back in I think encouraged and nurtured by the art. We need to push back in our actions and do things like what Lori's doing by establishing healthcare in a small place in Guatemala, like what the Catholic workers are doing by setting up communities, houses in the midst of poverty and feeding people. What we're trying to do at Sanctuary and saying housing first is a solution. It gives dignity to people and provides resources to help them embrace their humanity once again, and make inroads that way. So I think I don't think I probably would agree with Coburn. It's not going to convert anybody, but it might provoke us to think about things differently and nurture us in our activism.
Yeah, thank you.
First of all, do I see your finger?
Yeah,
I
and
wanted
a
my
follow up. I mean, a follow-up
Pentecostal
question.
roots. I want to be saying, "Yes, Lord, I see that hand."
Yeah, a follow-up comment and question, which is, I mean, Merton was also selling. I mean, not selling. He was actually doing poems for musicians to get funds to pay for the education of African Americans. I have been reading today actually the entire exchange of letters between him and the African American he gave his personal rights to get all the money from whatever performance of that music will be. But in terms of poetry, music, art, how do you see Merton in terms of addressing the importance of not only community, but also more prophetic witness and more resistance? Because that was part of your title, the resistance, using that imagination, the artistic imagination. How can we put it into our daily practice when there are so many things that it seems like to many people are overwhelming? I mean, where do you start building that beloved community and that sense of resistance when many people are afraid to speak out because they are afraid that they are going to go against them, that they can lose their jobs, that they can, have revenge? I mean, we saw how many people have lost their jobs in the US simply because they were the enemies of the state in terms of being critical of President Trump.
Yeah, there's a lot there, Cristóbal. I think looking at Merton first, I think what really intrigued me about that correspondence when the African American tenor asked him to write songs was that Merton wanted them to be freedom songs that had its roots in Black America, but also their roots in the Psalms. So most of those songs are rooted in the Psalms. And Merton at one point said, "I don't like what I've done. I'm going into the library in Louisville to listen to Black American music so I can do this better." Right. And I think that's really, really key. I think two of his poems, the poem on about Auschwitz, where he takes it's one of his experimental poems where he takes bits of letters from the commandant and parts of contracts for the building of furnaces and builds a horrific poem out of them, and then comes and turns it around and says, you're pointing the finger at me while you're burning up bodies in Vietnam, or the original child bomb poem as well. So that's the prophetic voice in his poetry. But I think what comes across to me so strongly is at the opening of New Seeds of Contemplation, he says that contemplation, that art, music, and poetry have something in common with contemplation. And part of that is I think that they're all can become part of our prayer and nurture us. So I think the ground for this is our nurturing and prayer. And also, and we talked a little bit about context and about vocation today, and you and Dominiek and Leo. I think that some of that too is discerning how we resist. I don't know that we're all called to exist in the same way. Merton's resistance to the powers and Merton's advocacy for peace was very, very different from Phil and Dan Berrigan's, and different again from Dorothy Day. And Jim Forrest's witness changed over a period of 50 years, from going out and burning draft records, being thrown in jail, and in retrospect, he said, it had a real impact on my ability to be a father. And I think he had some regrets over that, and worked a great deal on the inner work afterwards. And even as he hit 80, you could find Jim in the Netherlands holding up a sign at an anti-nuclear gathering. So he was still protesting, but at his age then, it wasn't like he was risking himself being put in jail. So I think we're all called to witness a little bit differently. But the foundation of that witness, I think for Merton, was his prayer. I think Hagia Sophia represents that in terms of the offices and the canticles that are there. But so I think for all of us, it's rooted in our contemplative life, and that we respond in different ways.
Well, thank you, Paul, and thanks everyone. I'm very happy that we've had this beautiful morning session with friends from so many different parts. I was also thinking about this idea of borders, frontiers, that has been touched upon in many of the papers, because everyone who's here is crossing boundaries to be at least virtually in this Argentine conference. And at the same time, there are many people who are originally from one place and are now somewhere else, and yet we are all gathered here. So this makes me very, very happy. We'll meet again in an hour, okay? That will be 2 p.m. here in Argentina, and, well, some other time in your time zones. So it's an hour from now. Bueno, muchas gracias a todos los que han participado. Recién pensaba cómo esta idea de las fronteras, los límites que ha aparecido en varias de las ponencias tiene que ver con esta situación en la que estamos, virtualmente conectados a través de Zoom en Argentina, pero también desde tantos otros lugares. Y bueno, pensaba también que varios de ustedes a lo mejor son originalmente de un lugar y ahora están en otro, y a pesar de eso estamos todos en esta jornada de Argentina. Vamos a hacer ahora el recreo, el lunch break, y volvemos en 1 hora. Okay. Nos vemos más tarde, y gracias, Gabriel, por la conexión. Thanks, Gabriel, who is the support man for technology at UNCUSA. So we'll meet again in an hour.
Muchas gracias.